Hello, everybody. I hope we are, everybody's doing good today, and certainly welcome and glad. It's good to be together. And today we are continuing our series we began a couple weeks ago through the Sermon on the Mount called You've Heard It Said. And today's message, I was thinking about this, made perfect sense in my head. And I'm going to do my best to make it make sense out loud in just a few minutes, over the next few minutes. But what I can assure you is that you're going to have to pay attention and you're going to have to think. That is the point. The Sermon on the Mount is not given to us. You have your Bibles. It's in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And there are volumes and volumes and volumes of books written on this. So I cannot do the whole thing in 3 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 20 weeks. But it's not designed to be read and then applied sort of instantly like some wise sayings or some good advice. It invites us to enter in, to consider some things and to think about some things deeply. The whole way in which this series is titled is modeled or is a nod to what Jesus did when he says, "You have heard it said," and then he gives or quotes from the Torah, and then he says, "But I say to you." And he sets up this thing that we have long thought or held, and then he sets his words against it in order for us to consider something more. What's required of us? What does this mean in the lives that we actually live? Like, what does this mean in who we become as a person and as a people? And so that's what this is driving at. So you're going to have to think, you're going to have to pay attention, and there's going to be plenty in here for everyone. So that's how we'll jump in. The first week, we began with the end of this sermon where Jesus said, we talked about where we find our stability, because at the very end of this, Jesus says, if you put these things into practice, you'll be like the person who builds their house on the rock. There'll be a sense of stability that isn't determined by your circumstances. Last week, we talked about where is that we find our values and how contrasted, or what a contrast it is from what we typically think about things and what God actually values and is inviting us to trust and make it a part of our lives. And today, I want to talk about where we find ourselves. Where do we find ourselves? And I want to do this in two ways. Number one, is I want us to consider where we find ourselves as a culture, as the world in which we live, where we find ourselves today. And the second is I want this to be a sort of personal challenge, is where do you find yourself? Right? We all know when we think about the condition of our world that it is, the emotion or the emotional tone is probably defined by a sense of anxiety or living just on the edge of anxiety. That seems to be the temperament that most people experience day to day in this world. And it's not assisted in any way by the messaging and by what's happening in the news and all the things that we hear day in, day, really hour in and minute out. It's just an avalanche of information, of news that makes us fearful, that makes us feel like things are hanging by a thread. We need more than ever a foundation that we can trust. And oftentimes in that it seems like almost anything we do doesn't make any difference anyway. And it's easy to grow cynical and to think that our actions are futile, and then we'll just sort of back in and do our own thing. So we're going to talk about that. And also I want you to consider where you find yourself, right? The way in which we do this in the world is you get to be in your mid-40s, you have to go find yourself. So you have to leave everything you've built, go do something else, find yourself, and hope that it's the right person that you find or whatever that thing is. We call it a midlife crisis. And now I think we've invented a quarter-life crisis, and before long we'll probably even be back sooner than that. But it's this idea that you have to leave what it is that you have built in order to go find yourself. And I wonder if there's a better way for us to do this. If we were to find a way to find ourselves in something, to do it sooner in a way that we'd actually support the weight of what we live by. And these are foundational questions. And as we sort of set this up, I got to give you two ideas. And this comes from a book that Dallas Willard wrote. Dallas Willard is one of my heroes. He died about 10 years ago. He wrote a bunch of books. But one of them was called Divine Conspiracy. It's probably his most famous book. It is far and away the most difficult book to read. It took me 2.5 years to read it. I started it about 8 times before I finally got through it, and I read a bunch of other people who talked about him before I could read it. So that's that. But it's about a 300 plus page volume on the Sermon on the Mount, and he calls it the Discourse on the Hill. He's Dallas Willard. He can do that. But one of the things he talks about is the good life. And he talks about this idea of reality. And he says that reality is God and his kingdom. That somehow this idea of God or our faith in God is not some part of our world that we deal with on Sundays or we deal with in our quiet time, but it actually is, it establishes a kind of reality in which we live. There's more than just what we see and taste and touch. That there's a reality of God and his kingdom. And that's an assumption that we all have to consider, that it's not just something ethereal, but actually is a way in which we enter in and experience this world. And then he talks about a good person and a good life, and he says the good life is to be alive in this reality, to be alive in God's kingdom. And so that's what I want for us to consider as we sort of set all this up. There's another book that I have read by Jamie Smith, and he says this. He said that to be human, one of the introductory lines in his book, to be human is to be animated and oriented by some vision of the good life, right? Whatever vision of the good life that you have is probably what's driving all of the activities of your life. If you think the good life is a good job with a good salary, that determines where you went to school and what kind of degree you got. If you think a good life is about having a spouse and being married and having kids, that's what you pursued, right? I think the good life will be making hammocks in St. John, so if this ever doesn't work out, that's where I'm going, right? You have this vision of things. And part of what we realize is that when we learn, the place that we find ourselves, where you're gonna find yourself, is not when you escape off and chase something, but it's actually when you find yourself, you'll find yourself at the end of what you desire, what you want, what you're hungry for. And this is what I want for us to build off of and kind of talk about what happens, what has happened to us, and then bring it back to what will happen to you or what you can do about what happens to you. That's how I want to outline this today. But this has something to do with what will satisfy us, what will give us a sense of life. And we need a vision of life, of a good life, that can withstand, right, the demands of our lives, the sacrifices that were required to be made. If you have a vision for something, right, it's got to be a vision that's strong enough to demand or to hold the sacrifice that required. If you want to have a profession that requires a lot of education, you got to have a vision for that profession such that you can endure what is required of you in order to get there, in order to experience that. And the same thing is true in our walks. We want a vision of what this life looks like, and it's got to be powerful enough that allows us or empowers us to make the sacrifices in order to pursue it, in order to experience it. And so Jesus starts this sermon, and when I started this series, preparing for this a few months ago, I did not want to focus on the Beatitudes because the Beatitudes are a little weird. And it's just like, blessed are the poor, and blessed are the meek, and blessed. And I, years and years I read this, and I would read it, and I just go, oh, that's good, and then I skip it. Right? That's what we do with things we don't really understand. We read it, we say it's good, we just go on. Because it's in the Bible, it's got to be good, and we just skip it. And so I've spent the last few months just kind of mulling over the Beatitudes, which is how they're designed to be read. They're not designed to be just read once and then applied. You read it and you enter in. And you quote it and you think about it and you meditate on it, you chew on it. So I've been spending some time with this. And the Beatitudes are essentially, they reveal the character of God's kingdom. And they also give us the surprising recipients of God's blessing. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. These blessings. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And he goes on like this. So what I began to notice is these, when you sort of just I just mapped it out and drew it out and sort of reflected on them, that these first three things are things that happen to us. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, who find themselves sort of beaten down without a lot of hope, maybe growing cynical. There's just sort of a poverty of hope. There's nothing inside of us that wants anything more than what we already have. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. They've suffered loss. Something has happened to them that leaves them in a place to recognize that they don't have what they hoped they would have, so they mourn it. For they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek. Right? These are those who they don't have any status in the world, and whatever they do is not likely to bring them any status in the world. Blessed are those people. These are all conditions of things that have happened to us, or things that happen to people, leave them marginalized or leave them in a position of needing something. And then there's this next one. And it's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 6. And he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied, or they'll be filled. And it's interesting to me because this isn't something that we're really familiar with. Hunger and thirst we are. Now, if he said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for food, right, that would make sense with what he said before, because that would be something that's happening. But now he's adding something to this. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who have this innate desire for something that we're largely unfamiliar with. And this is talking about hunger and thirst. This isn't talking about working yourself up and getting motivated. This is talking about the innate desires that human beings have. None of you have to work to be hungry, right? You just are hungry. It just happens to you. It'll happen sometime in the middle of our time together. You'll be sitting there and you'll go, oh my gosh, I'm hungry and I want PTs. And what you'll say is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for PTs, for they will be satisfied when they get to PTs. And now you can't pay any attention to the rest of the message because you're thinking about PTs. But it comes out of nowhere and you want something. And what he's saying to us is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst. This desire comes out of nowhere and you are hungry and thirsty for what? For righteousness. And my question is, do you have a vision for that? You know what PTs looks like. You know what it's going to taste like. You know what it's going to feel like. Do you know what righteousness is in the sense that you are willing to do the kind of things that you'll do for PTs, to do this for righteousness, to hunger and thirst? He's talking about desire. And he's doing this for multiple reasons, because this is, we're going to be filled up with the thing that we are hungry for. So, where do we find ourselves? We got two parts. Where do we find ourselves? We live in a world that I would say is kind of governed by chaos. Would that be a fair statement? Just feels chaotic. And again, I don't want to make indictments or critiques. I want to make some observations. And in chaos, what human beings do, and this is almost always, out of chaos, we bring or long to bring a sense of order. And wherever order emerges from chaos, it requires us to build a system. And it's interesting when you read the Sermon on the Mount speaks to this. A lot of how things are organized and addressed, and it calls us as individuals, and not just individuals, but as individuals who are part of this people of God, those who belong to God, to something different. But what you got to get in your head is that wherever there's chaos, there's always order. And the way we get order is by creating a system. And we do this all the time. We do this in every possible way. When you have kids, it's chaos. And the first thing you try to do is you try to create order. You have bedtime, and you have nap time, and you have dinner time. And then when they get older, you lay their shoes out, and their pants out, and their underwear out, and their clothes. You do all these things to create a system so that you create order out of chaos, or at least as much as possible. We create systems in our homes all the time. We have a system. I have a system for how to load the dishwasher, right? And some of you have this. And all of our systems are addressed, are set up based on what it is that we value. The reason I have a system for loading the dishwasher is because I value the way the dishes go into the dishwasher. Anybody feel me with that? Right? Some of you can't believe that people care about that. I do. And I don't know where it came from. And so I have a very good system of how cups and plates and forks and knives all go. I tell people, I was like, I don't put my fork. You put your fork, you pay attention? I'm like, yes, because I don't want to jab myself when I reach in there to get them out. And they're always organized in all the things. And so what happens to me is my wife likes to help me load the dishwasher. She has a completely different value system than I do. And so what I try to do is, like, the sink's here and the dishwasher, she's not here today, so I can probably say this to get away with it. But the sink's here and the dishwasher's here. So I usually stand here at the sink, and I'm a rinser, man. I rinse, and I get all the junk out because it needs to go. That's my value. And so we're doing this, and what she wants to help. So she comes and she stands at the sink, and then I'm kind of pinned here, right? And then she starts rinsing the dishes and just setting them on the counter. And some of you cringed immediately because you know what happens when you put wet dishes on the counter? It just gets a pool of water that just runs off the counter. And so I just try to put them in there as fast as I can. But what begins to happen, right, is there is a system that now competes with a value. I value the way dishes go into the dishwasher. But I also value my wife, right? So what am I going to do in that moment? Like, which value? I know what you do. You try to convince her to value the same things that you value. And that only gets you in trouble. right? These are the systems that we've created. We've created them in all of our relationships. We've created them almost every way we do things. You have heard it said, the dishes need to go into the dishwasher a particular way, but I say to you, there's a different value that you might want to pay attention to, right? This is exactly what Jesus is driving at in this. We all have these ways in which we do things. And what you need to understand is that this isn't a bad thing. Systems and order are not bad things. Creating order from chaos was the way the Genesis account is presented to us. The world was formless and void, and the Spirit brooded over this. That's the picture in Genesis 1. And then God begins creating order out of chaos. He begins by separating the light from the dark and the skies above from the skies below. It's this act of separation to bring order out of chaos. And it's such that it allows people, ultimately humans, to participate and to cooperate. That the idea of creating a system, of a governance, was in order to allow people to participate such that human beings could contribute and cooperate to sort of collective flourishing. That was the whole game. And every governmental system, every system of anything is ultimately designed for that. The reason you get your kids stuff is so that ultimately they flourish. Even if they flourish by you not yelling at them the whole morning, it's still flourishing that is the vision. There's a sense of value that drives all of our systems. And so this isn't a bad thing, and I'm not trying to critique things, but I want you to understand that what happens is, just like the system of loading the dishwasher, at some point, the system gets your allegiance at the expense of what it is that you value. And when you do, those values get formed. When you do, those values get formed. There's big systems at play in our culture, economic systems, political systems, that started with a particular value of opportunity, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all those things. And then those systems develop allegiances that then reshape or reform our values, such that more than likely, and I could just, I don't want to be, but I want us to be prepared because the election season is coming. There's a lot of noise already. And my concern isn't who you vote for. To be quite honest, I'm just really embarrassed more than anything right now. And it saddens me. It saddens me that this is how we speak and talk and feel like we need to get things accomplished. Because the value is no longer about those things. It's about staying in office. It's about winning elections. It's about, and all of a sudden everything just degrades from that. We have systems, and we need to be prepared how to navigate chaos as a kind of people. This isn't about navigating it and making things the way we want them. This is about navigating it with the authenticity to who we actually are as people. That's my concern. My concern isn't how you navigate the world, but who you navigate the world as. That we learn to live in allegiance to the values that Jesus have in whatever system we end up in. There's political systems, there's economic systems. Right, I don't have time to get into this, but a lot of the basis of economic systems in our country, right? You have the gold standard, you have a sense of the right to own property, which is an equity-based model, which the whole reason you have an equity-based model, the equity has to get more and more and more and more, has to keep increasing in value. And there's no question you will eventually have an affordable housing crisis when that's the system. It's built to do that. And so these aren't critiques, it's just ways for us to consider. We have to think about what is the value that we are to hold as citizens who live in a different kingdom. We have educational systems. You have systems in your family that say, this is what we value as a family. I value my kids being well behaved. I value my kids having the right schools or going to the right schools. I value my kids, whatever it is about your family. When we were growing up, we had a value that we structured, we created systems around in our home with my two daughters. And that value, the high value in our home was trust. And every system has to be built around that thing so that you never lose sight of that value because everything else will vie for it. And then you become allegiant to systems of efficiency and you lose your values in the meantime. What actually happens, you don't lose your values. Your values are formed by something differently. And this was my challenge last week, right? We have to get ourselves into a way of living and relating with Jesus such that he becomes the primary formative force in our lives. And so that's where we find ourselves. So what's happened in all of this? Well, honestly, it's the same thing that has happened since the very beginning of time, since the very first rebellion, that we feast on the tree of knowledge, and we end up living in the consequences of that, namely independency to the law. It is interesting, there's two trees in the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. I think those choices are still available to us today. We ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think the strategy of Satan was this: give human beings enough information and they will destroy themselves with it. That's exactly what is happening. And there's this other way that's been made available to us. I've mentioned, because what happens when we get this idea of knowledge, then we have to build systems around that, and that system looks like the law, and we're governing things. And what I mentioned, I said this a couple weeks ago, but that the law is insufficient to govern humans the way we're actually intended to live. It's fascinating to me that in this current cultural moment, right, we all believe, or most everybody believes, that the law should be regarded, it should be honored, that it's a good thing. And I'm not suggesting that it's not. We just believe this is a culture. Yet we have an entire sector in our culture that's devoted to finding loopholes in these laws. And we have an entire sectors in our culture that are designed to close those loopholes. And what happens is the law gets more and more and more and more like a fine filter, and it just becomes more and more and more about the minutia of how things are, and it reduces us in the process. It does something to us in the process. We learn how to get by using the law, and we miss the whole other way of this. Now, let me make a quick disclaimer, and then I want to tell you, kind of illustrate that, what I mean. I am not an anarchist, okay? So don't hear me saying, we're not doing that. I just really believe that we have to learn to walk in the way of Jesus. Like, this is going to require something from us. We have to learn how to value the things of his kingdom, generosity and reconciliation. We have to learn how to value what it means to live out of the character who we are becoming and live as his people. We have to learn how to do this. We have to learn how to navigate the systems that may not be likely to change in 4 years or 12 years or maybe even in our lifetime. We have to learn how to navigate these systems by bringing a measure of shrewdness and surety and beauty that contributes to pockets of redemption wherever we have influence in a way that reflect what God intends for humanity and for his rule and his reign to be. And this is going to take tremendous creativity, and it's going to take tremendous resolve and tremendous innovation. But I think that we're poised for that. That's what I want for our church. But here's what I mean by this. When it says there are commands and rules that are given, they get more and more and more refined. And we can say, I didn't actually do that. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's like I was only 3 miles over or whatever it might be that you use to justify whatever you do, using the law to do it. But I've told this story, and this is how I think about this, because there's a command in the top 10, and it says, thou shalt not commit adultery, right? And everybody's like, oh, that's a good command. But very few people go, that's a terrible idea. But thou shalt not commit adultery. And so then it governs a marriage, a relationship. So imagine, I've been married almost 32 years. I come home from work. Hey, Julie, how was your day? She says, good, how was yours? I say, it was good. Did you commit adultery today? She says, no, did you? I say, no. We go, yes. Right? We don't do that. Why? And people ask me all the time, they come up to me because we all recognize something that would be a little weird. And it wouldn't even begin to tell the story. And so what people ask me, I said, when we have this conversation, I said, how much authority do you think that command has in my life? And everybody's like, well, you're a pastor. It should probably have a lot. I'm like, 0. It has 0 authority in my life. Why? Because the rule of love governs this much differently. It doesn't say, thou shalt not commit adultery. It says, why would you think about doing that? Because of your love for this particular person. Right? It's a whole different way of seeing and thinking, of valuing things. Not just getting by saying, I didn't actually do that. And we even use it, well, I didn't actually sleep with her, right? That's what Jesus said. Well, you've heard it said, don't do it. But if this even starts in your heart, there's problems with it already. This is what he's getting at. So this is how we have to think about this, and I am way behind. No, I'm not. All right. So here's that. That's all that. I want you to see this. This is from Christmas, if you were here. Isaiah chapter 9, the prophecy of Jesus, and he says, or of Isaiah regarding the coming Messiah, and he says, for unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and what is the next phrase? And what? The government shall be on his shoulders. The government shall be on his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. The government shall be on his shoulders. Verse 7, of the greatness of his government and his peace, there shall be no end. It is, make no mistake about it, he is inaugurating a system of order based on some values. And the system in which we learn to live in is going to be formative in those values. That's why it requires cooperation from us. And so when he says this, he goes on and he says he will reign. He will rule and reign on David's throne and over his kingdom. He's going to establish it and uphold it with two powerful words. What are they? He's going to uphold it with, you can say it out loud because I need you to tell me so I can write it down. Justice and righteousness. There's this idea again. And more than likely, most all of us have a vision of what this looks like. And it probably doesn't resemble the values of what Jesus is actually inviting us to. That's the challenge. Because our vision, right, when the law keeps getting reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced, it turns righteousness and justice into something that they aren't. We think of righteousness, right, is how well did I do what was expected of me? How well did I comply to the law? That's why you can say, were you speeding? And you say, no, I was only 5 miles over. We were righteous. And then what justice does is justice is the way in which you determine if this did or did not violate the law, right? Because someone came and said, yes, you did. Depends on how strict the judge is. Boom, you violate 5 over, you get a ticket. Or no, it really wasn't, you don't get a ticket. And that's what we think of justice, and that's what we think of righteousness. And Jesus comes in and he says he's going to uphold this kingdom with these two ideas. Of the greatness of this kingdom, they're going to be withheld with these two things. And what Jesus does is he comes and he inaugurates this in the most unexpected of ways. Right? He gives us a vision for the kingdom and a foundation that doesn't look like what we're familiar with. It doesn't really fit into any of the systems. The way of Jesus is not left and it is not right. Remember, I say this all the time. Left and right are two sides of the same coin. Anybody finish the sentence with me? In the wrong system. It doesn't fit into those. And the instructions to those who learn to live in this way are radically different than compliance. They're learning to be shrewd and to live with a sense of security. Right? It doesn't fit into systems and it doesn't oppose systems in the way that we think they should be opposed. This is all throughout the way Jesus lived and interacted with us. So here's what I've got to do in the next few minutes. I want to give you some background because this idea of righteousness, actually, in the old Hebrew, justice and righteousness were used almost interchangeably. As it comes on, you'll see these couplings throughout, particularly Psalms and a lot of other places, this idea of justice and righteousness. And what's interesting, in the timeline, so Jesus is born here. About a few hundred years later, maybe 300 and something years later, there was a guy named Plato. You've probably heard of him. Greek philosopher who is actually thinking about all of these ideas. And what he's wrestling with, and particularly in a lot of his writings, but he's wrestling with how do we get along and what is required for human beings to actually live a good life. That's essentially what he's wrestling with. And he's really wrestling with how is it that human beings can become the kind of people, like what kind of condition would they be in order for them to actually live out this life? What kind of people would they be in order so that living this good life would just come naturally? You know what word he gives for it? He uses the word It's a Greek word, dikaiosune. And he uses this word to describe the kind of person that you would have to become in order to experience this kind of life. So then, about 100 years after this little dot right here, right? The Old Testament is translated into Greek. So all the Hebrew stuff, it's called the Septuagint. And this is about 100 years, maybe 85 years after Plato. And they're translating all of the Hebrew writings of the Old Covenant into Greek, right? That's where we get it. So when they're trying to translate this idea that he's going to uphold and establish the kingdom with justice and righteousness, guess what word they use for righteousness? It's the same word. And then when Jesus comes along, right? When Jesus comes along a few hundred years later, right? Here's Jesus teaching this same thing. What does he say in the Sermon on the Mount? But seek first the kingdom of God and what? And his righteousness. So you got to ask yourself, what is this? Because whatever this is shapes the definition of this. This is the kind of thing that should we become like this, we would live out this good life. And what Jesus is saying to us, seek first the kingdom of God and the essence of his goodness, the good that would reside in us such that it would allow everything else to possibly be good. It's righteousness. This is not a corrective word. It's not really about your behavior. Did you behave in a righteous way or not? It really has to do with, are we rightly related? Are we rightly related with God, ourselves, with others, and the things around us? There's a sense of depth to this word that causes it's very relational. And what happens is the rightness is for things to be deeply related, rightly related to one another, to be deeply good, such that out of that goodness, therein might be the possibility for other things to become good as well, the righteousness of God. And so you've got to get this in your head, because what happens is when this becomes your definition, justice then isn't crime and punishment. It's the return or the redemption to this. Justice in God's economy and God's value is reconciliation. This is why he says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye. That makes perfect sense to us, doesn't it? If someone hits you, you hit them back. If someone takes your pen, you take their pen and give back, right? It makes sense to us. If your value is that the punishment needs to fit the crime. But Jesus says, I say unto you, if someone hits you on your left cheek, offer them your right. If someone makes you go or forces you to go 1 mile, you go the 2nd mile with them. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies by default. But I say to you, love your enemies. Like he begins to add this. Why? Because when the value is reconciliation, it changes the way you see justice. The value is for there to be a rightly relatedness to everything. It changes the way we view these ideas. This is what he's asking of us. Is it hard? Yes, it's hard. But it hinges on us becoming the kind of people who live this out quite instinctively. This idea of righteousness, dikaiosune, is the word that best represents how salvation is talked about in the New Testament. It is all through Paul's writing. In fact, he says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. He, God, made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin, to bear and become our sin, to absorb it unto himself, so that in him, what might happen? We become the kind of people for whom this goodness deeply resides, such that out of that, there's a hope for everything else to become good. That is a beautiful picture. So what this depends on is, right, the kind of person that you become. The values of Jesus' generosity and reconciliation they all rest on you living out of who you are. You've heard it said, don't do this. But I say to you, become the kind of person for whom these things aren't likely. And here's how. You do that by remaining and residing in me. That Jesus becomes the most formative force in your life. And y'all, this is going to require something from us. Our values are going to constantly be reformed and formed by the systems that we are most used to. And Jesus is inviting us to live in a different way, a government that rests upon his shoulders, and a government whose greatness and whose peace shall know no end. It is a way of life for us. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to kind of test yourselves as we become this kind of person. It requires sort of a reorienting of ourselves, and this has to happen frequently. But I want to invite you in the closing few moments we have together before you go get PTs, is to take an audit, to audit yourself, to do this personally. If you're really brave, let someone that you know really well do it for you, but I would start with yourself. So here's the first thing that I would have you audit is audit the access that things have to you. What kinds of things have access to your head and your heart? I can tell you what has access to your head and heart. It's whatever is on your phone. Right? What kind of access? It's what you listen to, your podcast. It's the news that you consume. What has access to your head and your heart? It's the music that you listen to. All these things have access, and I'm just asking you to do an audit. What kinds of things have access? And then number two is what kind of systems monitor this access? More than likely, not much. And it shapes us. So if we're going to be the kind of people, right, who learn how to live like this, we've got to understand, we've got to learn how to remain and to trust. We're going to talk more about this next week. But to do an audit on what has access to your heart and your mind, what has access to your soul. Number two, do an audit on your words. What kind of words come out of your mouth most easily? I was going to say naturally, but most easily. What are the phrases that you just use? Sometimes you use these phrases to get people out of your space, don't you? Right? What kind of words come to you most easily? Oftentimes, these words are words that we're familiar with and that we use habitually, and we haven't really considered their meaning in quite a while. So what kind of words? Just make a list. When someone asks you how you're doing, or someone asks you what you think about a particular thing, do you say the same thing every single time? Because if you do, and you've been doing that for 5 years or 10 years, you haven't really thought about it in a very long time. Things that probably are worth thinking about and considering. What kind of words come out of our mouth easily? Are you careful with how your words affect others? How careful are you, right, that you're consistent in your usage of them? Next question, are you prone to use words to manipulate, preserve, project, or protect a perception? Do you use words to manipulate reality or to allow people to believe just enough? Most of our media is a masterclass in how to do that. Very few things in our culture are designed to communicate what is actually true, and they want you to, and what you need to know. It's usually designed around what they want you to know and feel about something. And so we just have to be different. Are you prone to twist the words of others to get your way or to prove your point? You can ask someone you know about that one. They'll tell you real quick. Number three, to audit your allegiances. What kind of allegiances do you hold that might even inadvertently work against kingdom values? This gets to our politics. This gets to our money. It doesn't just go there. It gets to the kind of alliances and the kind of cliques we form. The kind of things that we conform into, these groups and tribes that we give allegiance to, we belong to protect or to project or a host of other reasons. And Jesus comes along He's building a kingdom that is established with a fierceness to redeem what he's intended for humans. And to do so by taking our sin upon him so that you and I would actually become the kind of person, the goodness, out of whom the possibility would be that all things could also be good. Blessed are those who hunger and who thirst for this kind of life, because that is where you will find your satisfaction. That is where you will find these desires fulfilled. And wherever you find your desires you're fulfilled, you will find yourself. And my hope is that we will be found as the righteousness that has been given to us and made available to us by Christ. That's a tall order, isn't it? But man, it is such good news. It is good. It is great news that the possibility for something to happen in you so deep that it would change and shape the way in which you see and what you bring to everything else. Father, would you help us? Help us to see. Give us a vision of this rightness, this rightly relatedness that compels us, that draws us, that makes us hunger and thirst for this kind of thing to happen. God, that's what I ask you to do, to make us into that kind of person and in that kind of people. God, the world desperately needs hope and a sense of goodness. Would you use us to bring that to bear? And I lift all this in your son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.